Okay, welcome everyone to our March 12th, 2025 Apereo Microconference. I'm Wilma Hodges. I'm an Apereo board member and I'm also the Sakai community manager, and I'll be moderating the session. So I'm going to do a quick intro of our speaker and then I'll help with questions at the end. But before I get started with that, I do want to remind folks to, if you haven't already signed up for the newsletter, you might want to join. That way you can stay up to date with any Apereo events such as this microconference and other events. You can find it on our website if you go to www.apereo.org, and all the way at the bottom, you'll see in the footer the join the newsletter link. So that's how you get signed up. And I do encourage you to do that if you haven't already done so. And today's speaker is Sam Boysel. He's a postdoctorate scholar at the Laboratory for Innovations of Science at Harvard. His research interests are at the intersection of digital technology, labor economics, and public good production. His work explores both how firms and individuals create, use, and benefit from digital goods, such as open source software and artificial intelligence, and seeks to understand how these technologies can shape economic behavior more broadly. He's engaged in research collaborations with private industry, the public sector, and nonprofits. Sam has earned degrees from the University of Southern California, Tufts University, and UCLA, all in economics. And he is going to be talking with us today about the insights from the 2024 Open Source Funding Report, which came out as a result of the inaugural survey that looked at some of the resources committed to open source software development, because that's not an area that people typically, have on their, as a budget line on their budget. So it's something that hasn't been explored very deeply, and this report looks at that. So he is going to tell us all about that and also provide us some tools to measure the value created and the impact from those investments. So I am going to now turn it over to Sam.
Thank you, Wilma, and thanks for having me. The big shout out to Patrick and Jen for coordinating. I'm going to go ahead and try to share. Great. Well, thanks for having me. I'm Sam. I work at Harvard's Laboratory for Innovation Science, and broadly we study the ways that digital technology, specifically open source and increasingly stuff like artificial intelligence, create value, how firms and individuals will benefit from this stuff. I work with people like Frank Nagel and Manuel Hoffman, who I believe has been a guest here before. So if you're interested in any of our work, I encourage you to come check out our CVs and look at the projects that we're working on. And if there's ways that we can have mutually beneficial collaborations, please don't hesitate to reach out. If I can't help, I'm sure I might know a person or two that is doing research in your space. So today, we're just going to talk about this inaugural open source funding report, and this primary objective that we set out to accomplish was just better understand what organizations, be they nonprofits, private firms, large academic institutions, big organized sources of resources that are getting poured into open source. We just want to measure the amount of resources that are flowing in, whether they are financial contributions, whether they're labor resources, or are there other challenges of monitoring this stuff, or also to better understand why they're doing it, how they're contributing. So the first order of business was just to measure the amount that goes in, and then we get into all sorts of additional nuance of why and how. So I encourage you to check out the full report. I will go over the high level details, and there's plenty of other interesting little tidbits that are buried in the report. So I hope you find that valuable. Just want to plug the team here really quickly. This was a collaboration between Harvard's LISH, which is primarily myself, Frank Nagel, Manuel Hoffman, Daniel Yue, and Alexander Schaub, who's not listed, unfortunately. but also the GitHub, Kevin Crosby and Jeff Lush and Stephanie Lincoln were big driving forces and coordinating forces behind this. And and we also worked with Linux Foundation research. So Hillary Carter and Anna Hermanson were invaluable with helping us make the right connections in terms of distribution and guiding on open source surveys. And very few people do it better than the Linux Foundation research. So highly recommend both GitHub and Linux Foundation for doing this type of work, and big thanks to the team. Just to recap, yeah, the issue here is funding details are really surprisingly challenging to gather. There's not a central clearinghouse of how much. This isn't exactly advertised by every company. It's very distributed in nature. Individual employees at organizations might be contributing and using open source to different extents and not really reporting it to their employer. So a lot of this behavior, use, and contribution goes under measured and underreported. So if we wanted to measure organization-driven investment, we have to ask a few questions to what we hope is a representative sample of the ecosystem and extrapolate from there. We're also interested in the how and the why. So we get into some details of what are your challenges, what are your motivations in funding, what are things that you'd like to see change, and we ask a lot of kind of candid, open-ended questions. So we got some really interesting insights from free response questions. And we're going to use these insights to kind of shape some policy recommendations and coordinate some high-level learnings. So just to organize our thought, how do we think about this flow of funding? And so slight misnomer when we say open source funding, it's not necessarily how can I get more funding to my open source projects or funding from my OSPO. It's more of an open source contribution or open source investment by organizations to all of these different open source spaces. And so we think of these resources in two broad buckets. They're labor or direct financial contribution. So labor might be an employee works on a project during company time. And then once these resources flow into open source, they could go directly to foundations like Apereo, like the Linux Foundation, other large open source organizations. They could flow directly into communities. Maybe these are packaging ecosystems, other groups. They could flow directly to maintainers of projects, or they could flow to the projects themselves. And it's also kind of important to note that's not something that's not captured in this diagram would be the flow of resources from communities and foundations back to maintainers and back to projects. So if we were to look at the subset of respondents in our survey who represent foundations or open source organizations who are dedicated to supporting open source, just basically channel funding and resources and give them back to the ecosystem. Ultimately, a lot of these, the beneficiaries of this flow of resources are maintainers and individual projects themselves. Just to break down the survey, we've already, hopefully we've covered the objective of the survey, but our audience really was a group of OSPOs, heads of engineering, C-level executives. So we're targeting this distribution at the organization level, where we're sending this out to individuals, but they respond on behalf of the organization that they're employed by. And we wanted this to get into the hands of people who are most likely to have answers to these questions, because questions about organization-wide funding the people most likely to be able to answer them are the people in charge of OSPOs, are maybe heads of engineerings or executives of companies. If they are able to answer those questions at all, what we find is that even the heads of these companies kind of sometimes don't have a full comprehensive overview, and at best can really just guess at how much labor, for example, they're contributing to open source. Things like financial details might be available, but they're not readily available. They're not easily Googleable. Maybe the company doesn't track it in a single budget item. They might need to kind of collate this information. There's cost to gathering this information. So hopefully an outcome of the survey is that we kind of organize thinking around how to gather this information, decentralize reporting, incentivize individual reporting by employees, so that this isn't such of a headache or a costly thing to do, and that we can really put the measurement on the I of ROI. So we're not necessarily measuring a return on open source, but we're at least being able to ask, how much are we investing in open source? So our distribution, we put together a mailing list. The Linux Foundation and GitHub obviously have excellent contacts. So we took a sort of a union of those two lists, and we also distributed via the to-do group. And the format of the survey was about 47 questions. Unfortunately, it was a longer survey and took about 19 minutes. If we did this again, we would acknowledge the prevalent survey fatigue that everybody in the space is probably feeling a little bit. So we would probably tighten up the survey, make it a little easier to answer, so that we don't have attrition or people looking at a 47 question survey and deciding, no, thank you, I'd rather do something else. So luckily we did get responses from over 500 organizations by the time we closed the survey. But unfortunately, not all of those answers are complete. There is a bit of attrition for some questions. We have to account for that when we answer a question about all open source organizations. So just to get to our key findings, we from our survey, we extrapolate from our respondents to be representative of all open source organizations worldwide. And we come up with an estimate of $7.7 billion flowing into open source every year across financial and labor resources. Most of this contribution comes from labor. 86% of contribution in our survey responses comes from employee labor. So we ask questions of, how in dollars, how much do you contribute financially? But we also asked things like, if you had to guess how many labor hours in a year go to open source, or how many employees are working on open source and what percentage of their time are they working on open source. We asked a few different ways. We can kind of disaggregate an individual respondent's contribution in financial terms and in labor terms. What's clear is that organizations are not clear on their funding specifics. These things are hard data items to gather. If you're a large university that employs potentially thousands of independent academics that are all maybe contributing to open source, these things are, unless you had a centralized process to monitor, these things aren't going to be at your fingertips necessarily. And even smaller organizations didn't have a good handle. So organizations have a really clear idea on how they're contributing, why they're contributing. Oh, we're contributing to projects that we own in our independent, we fully manage, we allow community contributions, or we're contributing to our dependencies, we're contributing to stuff that we directly consume. But when it comes down to the very specific questions about dollars and labor resources that are going into these things, it's not immediately at everyone's hand. So the goal of this survey is maybe to guide, maybe we make that information a little more front of mind. And decentralization tends to exacerbate these monitoring frictions or these monitoring obstacles. And the benefit of decentralization is to reduce collaboration frictions. If there was a centralized process and I needed to ask my large organization, can I work on this open source project? For every single project, it might not encourage much contribution. Things might not get done. But on the flip side, the monitoring, we lose a little bit in terms of centralized monitoring. So if we can find a compromise between encouraging decentralized contribution, free contribution, but incentivizing employees to report back what they're doing, maybe an estimate of how much they worked on this individual project or use this individual project, that might allow us to get best of both worlds. So I guess I can pause here and take any questions, if there's any initial questions.
If you do have any questions, feel free to put them into the chat. I actually have a question. Given that Apereo and a lot of the projects within it are sort of higher ed focused, I'm curious if from the 500 or so organizations that were surveyed, about how many of those were higher ed organizations?
Yeah, I don't have the number off the top of my head, but there definitely were respondents from higher education. We had a really candid comment from a large research university that comes later in this presentation, that basically says the same challenge that we're all thinking. Like, I work at a big university. There's a ton of people working on open source. There's no central oversight. How would I even begin to monitor open source? We just don't do it. But in terms of volume, I believe the breakdown by industry should be in the open source survey. So if you go to the full site, and I will go ahead and share this in the chat for folks who have joined a little bit later, but there should be an industrial breakdown later in the report. But yeah, good question.
Okay, great, thank you. Does anybody else have any other questions right now?
Great. So yeah, feel free to interrupt. I'm happy to take questions as they come up. So on to our top level question: how did we get to this 7.7 billion number? We have a response. We have about 149 organizations of those 501 who provide solid financial information, enough financial information to make an estimate of how much they contribute annually. Obviously, not all of the 501 organizations answered that question. A lot just left it blank. So this is something we have to deal with and have to acknowledge when we interpret these results. We're extrapolating based off of a small sample. The challenge is that this sample is probably not representative. We targeted large, more likely open source contributors from the LF and GitHub's mailing list, the To-Do group. These are large organizations, private companies, NGOs that are most likely to be large share contributors, or most likely to have an OSPO, which is a big factor in your monitoring capacity. So we have to acknowledge that this is not a representative sample of all open source contributors worldwide. And we also need to just have a number of how many organizations would be in this population worldwide. So we do a few things. We're going to calibrate this sample of 149 responses to identify what part of the distribution do we think that these organizations sit in terms of the amount of open source resources that go into open source. So they're probably closer to the top end, but we also want to capture a lot of these small share contributors in the left tail that might not have been targeted by this survey. So what we do is we take the distribution of commits from GitHub in public repositories, and we calibrate this distribution using our sample, right? So we need to say, let's say that we consider an organization to be a contributor to open source if they commit 5 commits in a year. If we use that threshold, we get about 21,000 organizations worldwide are contributors to open source. Most of these are going to be small share contributors who, contribute a handful of labor hours a year, but we need to capture the large left tail. So if we do this exercise and we acknowledge that this threshold might be a little bit different, and that the wage that we're using to calculate labor value might vary by region. The U.S., Western universities might have a much different wage threshold than universities or open source contributors outside of the EU and the U.S. So what this graph is showing is that if we took our calibration exercise and varied a couple of these assumptions, we might come up with a range of estimates. So for example, on the far left, the first 3 bars let's say that the commit threshold was 100 commits. So we only consider an organization to be an open source contributor if they make more than 100 commits in a year. It seems a little high. So if we use that threshold, we'd only have about 6,700-ish organizations. that we need to extrapolate our 149 to. And then we allow the wage estimate to vary. So if the wage that you pay your employees is $30, we come up with an estimate of 2.9 billion. If it's $45, we come up with an estimate of 4.2 billion per year, and so on and so forth. We think that we ought to include these small share contributors. So we opt for a contributor threshold of 5. We want to capture a lot of the small organizations that might not be in the survey. And we also choose a composite wage of $45, which is sort of a composite between a global composite of wages that matches I'm not sure if you guys have seen the value of open source paper that Manuel and Frank are co-authors on, and Yanao Zhu, but they estimate the total value of open source software, and they use a composite wage of 45. So to be consistent with that paper, we're going to stick with a wage of 45 to arrive at this estimate of 7.7 billion. So this is to recap, we take our survey sample of only 149 observations, and we extrapolate that to be representative of all organizations worldwide who contribute open source resources. So this would exclude, contribution that I do in my private time, but this should capture investment by organized labor, organized firms, organized nonprofits or academic institutions to open source. And just to put this in context, there's other studies that have attempted to do a similar exercise, but there's slight differences between each one. So Blind et al. Took an estimate in, I think it was 2019. They sought to estimate, well, at least for the European Union, how much resources are flowing into open source by European companies. They came up with an estimate of 1 billion euro per year. Manuel, Frank, and Yano, in their value of open source paper, one of their results was to estimate, well, what's the one-time replacement cost of this core critical open source infrastructure? And they came up with a number of 4.15 billion. This does exclude some projects, but and the other thing to keep in mind that this is just the core infrastructure. There might be firms working on or academics institutions working on a wide range of open source projects that are valuable to them or to smaller communities, but don't necessarily constitute core infrastructure that are widely depended upon by many, many people. This survey doesn't tries to have a worldwide scope and doesn't discriminate between the exact type of software, other than does a organization contribute to it. So this is an annual cost as opposed to Hoffman et al.'s one-time cost. And if we were to compare on the high end of these estimates, Korkmaz and others find that US investment in any open source project, so this includes private contribution, totals about 37 billion per year. I'm just going to pause here. It was a little technical and probably got a little rough at some point. So if there's any questions that I can take or anything I can clarify on how we arrive at these estimates, the gist of this exercise is that we do something slightly different than the other authors, and we try to just put a dollar amount on organized contribution to open source per year using
Patrick actually has a question in the chat. I don't know, Patrick, if you want to read that off.
Yeah, so what does invest cover? And that's a good question, Patrick. It's we are considering both labor and direct financial contributions to be investments in open source. So if you pay your employee to, at least for part of their job, they might interact with open source and might contribute back to it. That's an investment. You're committing company resources to at least partially pay them to work on open source projects. And we try to capture this in our questioning by not just saying, well, we assume that the employee is working on open source 100% of their time. that's true for some employees, but it's not true for most employees. So we ask each respondent to say, what's the average share of time that your employee contributes to open source, and how many hours are they contributing? So we can kind of have a little bit better estimate of how much labor resources the firm is paying for to contribute to open source. Now, that doesn't mean that the firm might be deriving some benefit from that. The private firm, the academic institution, the NGO, they all have different objective functions, different missions in supporting open source. But the point is, we are considering investment in the financial sense. Money, we're writing checks to projects, to foundations, but we also have to acknowledge that a large share of the value that goes into open source is employee labor. So if we were just to look at financial investment in a more restricted sense, we would be ignoring a large share of the labor, of the value. So our objective here is to quantify both and put them into context beside one another. And I think there's maybe a second part of the question. We're organizing a Drupal user community.
Yeah, so I was wondering if it was just technical investment. So what about non-technical contributions that might be user communities?
That's a great question. So there's a few things. So our study ought to capture those if the respondent considers those open source contribution. So if the respondent said, well, my employees typically spend 50% of their time writing software code, and then they spend the other 50% of their open source time interacting with communities, maybe writing documentation, interacting with users, doing other support and really, valuable non-code activity, then our survey ought to reflect that value, that the value pouring into the community. The disadvantage of some of the other studies that I've alluded to is that to scale this up beyond a survey, you need to rely, there tends not to be a really good central source of coding and non-coding labor investment in open source. So they will leverage commit logs basically, and do software code estimation. Maybe it's a Kokomo-based method. It's really hard to scale what we do to all repos that are publicly observed. We have to kind of rely on surveying. So to kind of get to that point, maybe an outcome or recommendations of this type of work is to sort of have a better public index or a better measurable component of that non-code labor investment. So we were discussing in other parts, maybe a software bill of labor comes out of open source projects. Maybe in addition to the commit log, we also acknowledge at repository landing pages how much non-code contribution each individual contributor has helped. And there's ways to measure these on these large forges like GitHub, but there's not a consensus way to do it. Even less of a consensus around software cost estimation than that is code-based than is around like non-code contributions. So yeah, great question. And I think we are always trying to do better in terms of measuring these non-code contributions because they're super valuable. Thank you. Okay, just to break this down a little bit, as we've said before, in our survey, we get about $1.7 billion. Again, we're sampling the upper right tail of this distribution. We're sampling the big fish in terms of open source contribution. So this 1.7 billion of about 7.7 billion doesn't seem super far off. And if we break it down, we're answering this question. We're trying to answer this main question using a couple different survey questions. And so we have a preferred methodology from the variety of labor questions we asked to come up with a value for labor. And direct financial contribution is a little easier because we simply ask the respondent, how much do you contribute to these various different causes in terms of financial resources? But with labor, we have to do a couple tricks. And we come up with a split of about 86% labor, 14% financial resources if we're breaking down the dollar amount into these two different sources of investment. The other thing is, if let's say we broke down labor, well, where does this come from? We have to acknowledge that we have very different types of organizations in our sample. They're not just firms with one type of employee. They're not just, some of these are organizations that don't have full-time employees or part-time employees that contribute, but they immediately spend any of their revenue on contractor labor that goes to open source. So if we broke this down, 56% of contribution comes from full-time employees, but part-time employees is also an important component. So it's not dominated by full-time employees, and we have to also acknowledge that some of this ends up getting channeled to contractors. So this is another aspect of the decentralization part. The firm might have great insight over what their employees are doing, might have a more clear communication with their employees, but once that labor goes out the door, it becomes harder. Once the funding goes out the door to a contractor who's also doing open source work, it becomes harder to monitor. The other thing that we found was really interesting is that if we broke down the financial contribution, most of this is flowing back to labor. So this gets back to the point of the flow chart where I was mentioning that we really need a couple more arrows that are flowing from foundations and communities back to individual contributors and individual open source maintainers. So if 57% of financial resources are going to contractors, and then also to projects, to communities, to foundations, ultimately these things are working their ways back to maintainers. So this common refrain of pay the maintainers, luckily that's what we end up seeing in our survey data. And it's encouraging to notice that this breakdown, our friends at the Linux Foundation said this breakdown of financial expenditures is very close to how we spend our money. So it's kind of remarkable how close all of our survey respondents matched a large open source foundation like Linux. Great. So another big point that came up is that organizations tend to have blind spots when it comes to funding specifics. They tend to have a really good idea of where or why they're contributing to open source. So if we ask questions like, to what types of projects are you contributing to? What's your motivation to contribute to open source? Most of our respondents have an immediate answer for that. But as we get more and more specific on these nitty-gritty labor and financial details questions, this information just isn't readily available. And it's shame on us for asking a 20-minute survey of really detailed financial information. But hopefully we learn from this and we figure out a better way to kind of gather this information. And we've distributed some resources at the end to kind of give you the test in advance so that this is easier to prepare for. It's not as painful to gather. If another survey like this came along, you might have a company resource that gathers this information really easily. Or if you wanted to do monitoring yourself at your institution, this would be a less painful process. So this graph essentially shows a question attrition in terms of response rates. So about 20% of respondents have good information on how many open source software labor hours does your organization contribute relative to where do they contribute to open source. So the details are hard to get, aren't at hand, aren't easy to find, but the why is very well understood. And finally, our last main point is just monitoring decentralized contribution is a total challenge. And what might resonate with folks here is that one of our respondents candidly said, I work at a large research university. I don't know how the university contributes to open source because there are programmers working in so many areas. So answering a questionnaire or a survey like this might be a little frustrating if you want to give good information, but it's not at your fingertips. It would be nice if this respondent could at least have a centralized place where they and get just at least ballpark an estimate. Or maybe there's an internal, a quarterly or semi-annually or annually, there's a internal monitoring process or questionnaire that goes out that gathers this information, makes it a little more immediately accessible. And the other thing I mentioned earlier is that decentralization is kind of a double-edged sword. We like low collaboration frictions. We don't like super rigorous processes. I think maybe if folks are from academic institutions in this audience, maybe there's less of a rigid policy around open source contribution, but it can be problematic in IP sensitive or certain industries. Maybe it's healthcare or finance. There might be an explicit policy saying we don't contribute to open source, don't do it on company time. There's a lot of IP risk. There's strategic reasons not to do it, et cetera, et cetera. But when there's not an explicit policy, we also don't know what people are doing. So can we kind of strike a balance between not knowing what people are doing and encouraging folks to contribute to open source if it aligns with their work or the organization's work? So 2/3 of our respondents did not have OSPOs, even though we targeted OSPOs. A lot want to have them. They just, some of them are smaller companies that just don't have the resources. But if you're an institution and you have, starting an OSPO might be as simple as starting a GitHub organization that collects, maybe the first step if you're resource constrained and just want to track what we're working on in open source is you just start a GitHub organization and start to bring or link to projects that your organization is a present contributor in. The other issue is a lot of the ways we would measure organization contribution to open source is through commit logs, through version control systems. Where the employee might author a commit under their work email. And it's an imperfect way to measure it, but it's one of the best ways we have right now. But only 1/3 of respondents require their employees to author commits with their work email. Another third say it's strongly suggested, but not required. I would go as far as to suggest that this should be a policy of the company. This should, unless maybe there's strategic reasons not to do it. But if there aren't, why not just encourage or in some cases incentivize employees to author commits under their work email? Maybe there's an award or a raffle, low-cost way you can incentivize employees to self-report. The point being is that if they are incentivized to self-report in a decentralized fashion, that reduces the cost on you as the central authority to gather this information. So if a researcher like myself is a little more confident that employees are working on open source and always authoring their commits or their activity on platforms, like maybe they're engaging in issue sections on GitHub, things like this. If they're identifying or placing their organization's fingerprints on their work a little more often, while they're on company time, then observers or researchers like myself can go and just scale up our scans or polls of all this public data and better measure these types of things. So there's centralized monitoring is definitely one option, but it's costly. And if you don't have the infrastructure, time, resources, willingness to do that, we'll never get to measure that very well. And decentralized reporting has certain advantages. So I would encourage decentralized reporting where it can appear. So for example, IQSS, the Institute for Quantitative Social Science at Harvard, just has a repo. I don't know if y'all can see this, but if you just go to the GitHub IQSS, maybe I'll drop this in the chat. There's just a repo where it's just a simple list of all the projects where the Quantitative Social Science Institute at Harvard has affiliates working. So if you're working, and I see my colleague Jeff Courtmaker added a couple of his very excellent Python packages to this list. So go Jeff. But this is kind of employee initiated list of kind of crowdsourcing what researchers at this decentralized space are doing. So these individual researchers are incentivized career-wise to signal to be part of this large group. They want people to know that they contributed to these projects, that they maintain them. So we're kind of using individual incentives to encourage this decentralized reporting. But this might be something that's very low cost to spin up, that might be easier for just to gather a sense of what we're doing in terms of labor. And the advantage of doing this on platforms like GitHub is that while not perfect, we have a better chance of monitoring these non-code activities. So if we see you very active answering questions and authoring documentation, or interacting with users, these are important investments in time and energy that ought to be reflected in the value of investment by the organization. So I encourage folks to, if you don't already have that, this is a really easy first step. Great. So I do encourage you to, I'm going to skip over this for the sake of brevity, but I encourage you to read the full report. There's always roadblocks in open source. These are just additional insights that we got to at the survey, but there's always roadblocks, but stringent licensing requirements, project level bureaucracy might discourage outsiders from contributing to open source. So it's almost like I'm working in public, but it's still very siloed, and we're not really accepting other people working on this stuff. So this is always a challenge in open source. We found that cybersecurity audits are not a point of emphasis for organizations. Maybe not super surprising, but definitely something that deserves attention. Cybersecurity always has an ever increasing profile, larger and larger dependence on open source supply chains. We think that these things should come front of mind. And then organizations are differing by their objective functions. So larger organizations tend to care about standards and interoperability. Why they're contributing to open source is they want to benefit from these sort of scale economies and setting standards and not all working in individual things. They want to promote ecosystem cohesion. And smaller organizations tend to have different views. They want to they're concerned about the sustainability of projects that they consume, and they also have altruistic motives. They just want to give back. So please definitely give the open source funding survey a read through. And if you have any feedback or things that you think we missed, please don't hesitate to reach out. So if we were to do this again, or if we were to continue this line of work, we'd have to acknowledge that we can't keep running 20-minute surveys via email and expect a response. I think we were lucky to get the response that we did, but we ought to kind of refine our focus in future iterations of this. As we've pointed out previously, we'd like to encourage and consolidate decentralized reporting. So if there is decentralized reporting, is there a way we can kind of bring that all together in some type of a public index for reporting open source investment? So there's things like osrank.com, like these are individual efforts to measure organizational involvement in open source, but it would be great if there was, one index where I could go and find this is what, Harvard is contributing to open source every year. This is the breakdown of how they do it. That would be an ideal. And the way that we would like to basically complement something like a commit log, which is very technical individual contributions with a little more refined information on labor investment. So if you contribute to a project, it would be nice if there was a way you could acknowledge how much it costs you to do that. So what was your time cost in terms of investment? If this feature or this bug that you reported took you 5 seconds, it would be nice if that was reflected. But if you're making larger contributions, it would be nice if there were more refined ways or more direct ways to measure your level of involvement other than just counting commits or counting your time on platform. These are ideals. I don't, we're not close to getting there tomorrow, but these are first best outcomes in terms of research and insight in this space. So how does your organization gather insight on open source investment? So maybe I think we should take a pause and just maybe open it up to maybe wider questions. If maybe we can just pause here and use the last 10 minutes or so that we have to kind of reflect on what we've covered here. Are there better ways of doing it? Are we missing the mark on some things? I'd like to maybe open it up and I will skip we have an open source toolkit, but it's linked many times in the original survey report. So if you go there, you can find the toolkit and use it. And it has some tracking documents, some spreadsheets, some checklists to help this monitoring pipeline. So feel free to adapt, use as little of it or as much of it as you want. So I'll go ahead and open this up. I will take Patrick's question, maybe not included in the survey. Was there information about why orgs were initially investing and how that motivation might affect later investment? Yeah, the timing question, the dynamics, no, that goes beyond the scope of the survey. We at least have a snapshot of when they answered the question. We know why. If the respondent is answering truthfully and has full knowledge of what their organization is doing, or if there is a clear objective function, maybe if you're an academic institution, your objective function isn't super clear, but we don't have good information on why those dynamics might change. And you can imagine why they might change for strategically versus for private companies. Oh yeah, so maybe I'm, got it. So this might be a question of, do I want to stick around and keep dedicating my free time to thanklessly maintaining this project, or do I want to keep working on new projects? So yeah, super boring. Totally agree. Yeah, I don't think we had good insight on that. We know if they're doing, we know the type of contribution that they're doing by, is it, feature requests, is it, boring maintenance of projects, but we don't necessarily have a good sense of creation of new projects versus old projects. I will say that, we did a study of AI with Manuel, Frank, and others at GitHub and Microsoft. When you get these shiny new AI tools, you start to explore more, and you don't necessarily use these shiny new AI tools to maintain the project. You invest, you definitely are exploring new ideas, but you might deviate away from these original projects that you were a maintainer on. So technical solutions might not be a panacea for open source maintenance, not that anyone was holding their breath that they were going to be, but I think this is an important question. What happens if the key maintainer drops out? Or I think we need to start structuring projects so that they're not impenetrable code bases, so that there's not just one person who understands everything and everything grinds to a halt when they leave. If they're a little more modular, or if they're a little better documented, these things could be rescued or easily picked up. But no, our survey doesn't speak to it very well.
So Angela had a comment a little bit earlier in the chat about enterprise operations versus research. And she mentions that research value is determined by citations and patents and the influence of research, whereas enterprise value is something that would be collected by the methods in your study. Did you want to speak to a little bit of that dichotomy there?
Yeah, so I think maybe I'm ignorant of what enterprise operations might constitute. Is that just investment in usage in open source to replace a existing proprietary solution?
Yeah, enterprise would be whatever your central campus offers for like Workday, or whatever your HR system, whatever your, like we use DrupalKit at the University of Texas at Austin which is an open source software for our enterprise web development solution. If I'm looking at those enterprise class solutions that are offered by the university writ large, these estimations of labor are appropriate. But if I'm looking as the director of the OSPO at the value that my researchers provide, I'm not looking at these monetary values, right? And what's more, when my researchers go for tenure and promotion, they're not looking at this either, right? They're looking at the impact of research. They're looking at the value of their citations, their patents, things like that. So these are like two separate things that we're looking at. That would be my argument. And as the director of the OSPO, I don't worry about the enterprise value. And I work in the chief information office. But that's not the hat I wear when I'm looking at the value on my campus of open source software.
Yeah. So I think that's a really important distinction. Again, we're not doing a great job of, or even attempting to measure the value of either of those things for either enterprise value or for individual contributor value, individual career value, right, or research value. But it would be nice to break down those types of contributions by type. So if your organization was able to distinguish between this is a researcher who's just contributing open source, maybe as a part of a paper publication, or it supports their work in some way, versus this is maybe technical staff at the university who's investing time to make this solution work for your institution. That I think that should be measured differently. But again, we're not trying to measure the value for those two types of things. So at best, we could just suggest that we try to measure them, the investment, the I rather than the R of ROI, differently for academic versus enterprise type contributions. So I hope I'm
100%.
addressing
I
that
100%
question.
agree with that. No, I absolutely agree with that. You need both. So
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, but I think granularity, there's any additional granularity that doesn't impose a huge cost in terms of measurement, I'm always in favor of. So if you could just distinguish, like maybe the departments you're able to, I look at all the university employees at a particular institution and I was able to disaggregate them by affiliation. Maybe they're academic or research oriented, or this is staff, or if there's ways we can disentangle these things, I'm all for that. I think that's a great idea. You can always reaggregate back up, right? If I have the data at the most granular level, that only adds option value. Great. So I will encourage folks to take a look at our open source funding toolkit. I think I will go ahead and drop this link just so it's very accessible. It's also linked from the original survey report. So there's a handful of documents that we link to. There's a checklist, very high level. These are things that might be very sophisticated for your organization, might be very rudimentary for your organization. So one big piece of information, I mean, this is kind of obvious, right? That there's no one size fits all solution for everybody. So I think we just need to take a common set of materials and adapt them to your use case if you want to improve measuring. So this is a great place to start. You can take all the recommendations we have here or none of them. But just a simple checklist might be a good place to start. Tracking sheets, spreadsheets where we can, granularly attribute each independent contribution, be it financial, be it, we break this down by like in-kind donations, event sponsorships, contributions to individual projects. So this is super, super granular contributions. Obviously, this might be hard to do, but if this was distributed in a decentralized way, you just pass this on to employees who could, fill it out at their leisure, before end of quarter, before end of year, before end of, every 2 quarters, something like that. That might be a lower cost way to do these things. Yeah, Patrick, you could see this at the department level and then pushed up. I wonder too if projects could begin to collect this and share it back to the orgs that contribute it. That's a great idea. Yeah, it's I think, yeah, that kind of is in line with this decentralized reporting. And you'd have to, like, the incentives are just different. What does the project get by saying, maybe if I am running the project, I get I as the organization benefit from, signaling that we're shouldering the burden here, but I'm always in favor of more decentralization. Great. So I think we're just about out of time. Patrick's got to go do some more boring maintenance work, it sounds like. So hats off to Pat. Really appreciate that. And thanks for having me. I can stick around for a few minutes if others have questions, but feel free to contact me. My email is my first initial and my last name at hbs.edu. It's also linked in the survey report. So please get in touch if any of our work is interesting to you, or if you think there's a mutually beneficial collaboration, we'd be happy to chat about it. So thank you for having me, and best of luck with
Sam.
all your work.
That was a very interesting presentation. Definitely an area that could use more examination. So it'd be nice to come back to this later and see if maybe we can get a little more clarity around some of these questions that you've surfaced. So thank you so much for being here today and sharing information about the report. And thank you everyone here who attended for taking part in this micro conference and sharing some of your thoughts and questions with us. We really appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.